Now, meanwhile, in other areas, new ocean floor is going to be forming to replace the old sinking ocean floor. So the hot areas in this picture that you can see indicate where molten rock would have formed new ocean floor. And you can see the temperature scale in the lower right there. This hot sea floor would have vaporized huge amounts of seawater, resulting in a global rainfall of about 3 feet per hour. You know, many people have said, well, where'd the water, where'd the 40 days of rain come from? Well, there you are. And of course, this could be the fountains of the deep that are mentioned in Genesis.
Yeah,
right?
So here's a model that explains where the rainfall came from.
The words that we have in the Bible, yeah. And the darker blue areas are actually the subduction zones, where the pre-flood ocean plates are being pulled into the earth by gravity. And also note the vectors, the arrows indicating speed and direction. Look at India moving up and Asia moving down. This would be where they collide. That would be where we get the Himalayas, of course. So if the continents were moving slowly, as evolution suggests, it's doubtful that there'd be enough energy to push up the Himalayas. I mean, here's something, you take two cars out in the parking lot, you bump into each other at 2 kilometers an hour, you're not getting a lot
of damage. No.
Do it at 200 kilometers an hour, of course, you're going to get that massive
huge crumple zone.
Exactly, a crumple zone where you get the two continents coming and you get mountain building. It makes sense of what we see again.
Right. Yeah. Now, as the plates plunge toward the Earth, or being pulled by gravity in this conveyor belt-like fashion, there's a circulation, a stirring in the mantle that's set up. You have this stirring as the plates are plunging, kind of indicated here by the white arrows, and that circulates cooler material down to the core mantle boundary, just above the liquid core. And it's thought that as the convection then increases as a result of that cool material down by the core, then that will produce in the solid core a flipping of the Earth's magnetic field. And that's recorded, as we saw earlier, in this new ocean floor as it's being produced, this hot molten rock essentially coming up, for example, down the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, and it records the flipping of the magnetic field, which happened very quickly as a result of the increased convection in the liquid core, and then the solid core in the very center of the Earth flips back and forth.
Now, the new ocean floor being produced is a lot hotter and therefore less dense than the cold sinking ocean floor. So it rises between 1 or 2 kilometers higher than the old ocean floor, leading to a global flood.
Right.
That's where you get your flood from.
And it was Jacques Cousteau, actually, wasn't a creationist. He said that there's enough water in the oceans today to flood the entire Earth to a depth of more than 2 miles.
Right. So what are you saying? We live on the high parts, then you get the low parts like the Marianas Trench. I mean, if you were to equal the Earth out and it was like a perfect sphere,
right,
we'd be buried something like 2.8 kilometers everywhere on the planet.
So there's enough water to do the job for a global flood. All you need is a little vertical adjustment between the ocean floor and the continents. Well, that's exactly what this model would have produced.
Right. So this catastrophic plate tectonic model, it fits very well with what the Bible talks about.
It does.
It fits the time frame in the Bible, and it even provides a mechanism for the retreat of the floodwaters as well, as not just the breaking up the continents. Because for most of the duration of the flood, horizontal tectonic forces would have been the dominant forces, of course, and then towards the end of the flood, it would have been vertical movement that would have been the more dominant forces, and that would explain the continents coming up, the waters, flowing off of them,
yes,
and so on.
Yeah, once all of the heavy pre-flood ocean floor has subducted in that conveyor belt, that runaway subduction that we talked about,
right,
once there's no ocean floor left, there's nothing left to subduct. So the process, it starts very quickly, ends very quickly, and the whole process is very quick.
Yeah.
But then that hot, less dense ocean floor, because it's less dense, it sits higher on the mantle, it begins to cool and sink into the mantle. Well, right, now you've got vertical movements at the end of the flood, explaining the runoff of the floodwaters.
Right. Now, this is a scientific model. It's not just, it's just some religious thing, right? I mean,
yes,
the concept comes from, obviously we're looking at the physical things and interpreting according to what the Bible says, but this is a scientific model. Now, scientific models change sometimes significantly.
They do.
With future discoveries, and of course that's happening to both evolutionists and creationists. But now Christians have a model that explains many of these large geological features that we see around the earth, and within a biblical context. It's great.
That's right.
Yeah.
And this model, we believe, is superior to the evolutionist model. They have difficulties in some of their areas. And you can read about that in that chapter in the Creation Answers book there. But again, just because evolutionists have explanations doesn't mean that their explanations are the best. In fact, evolutionists even have reasonable explanations, things that make sense.
Right.
We can turn again to Mount St. Helens, that famous, the key and one of the key evidences. And here you see a canyon at the base of Mount St. Helens. Mount St. Helens is a volcano in southern Washington State in the U.S. And you see this canyon there, you see a little river running down the middle of the bottom. And it is very reasonable to suppose that that river carved the canyon over hundreds or maybe into the thousands of years.
Right.
That's reasonable.
Sure, you'd look at that evidence and you'd go say, okay, what could have caused that? And that would be a reasonable explanation.
Yes, but it's wrong.
Right.
Because, and here's where the importance of starting with the right history comes in. The right history of this canyon at the base of St. Helens here is that canyon was carved in a day, not hundreds of years or thousands of years, and the river had nothing to do with the formation of the canyon.
Right.
The river is an after effect. In fact, it's not the river caused the canyon, it's the canyon caused the river.
Right.
It's the opposite of what we normally think.
Now you've got a ditch there, basically, that's collecting water.
Right.
The river wouldn't be there if the ditch wasn't there, but the ditch wasn't caused by the river in the first place.
So because we didn't start with the right history, you get there and you think, oh, well, it makes sense that the river carved the canyon. And that does make sense. That's the point.
Right, right.
That's a reasonable explanation, but it's wrong.
Right.
Reasonable, but wrong. And then we can look at, again, the side walls of the canyon here. You see this layer between the yellow dotted lines. That was laid down in about 3 hours. Beautiful summer evening, late evening, again as a result of an eruption of the volcano. And if you look at a close-up view of that layer, you see this fine layering. Well, a reasonable view suggests that those layers, just millimeters thick that you see there on the screen, were laid down maybe 1 or 2 layers a year.
Like we'd see in, let's say, the mouths of rivers or things like that. If you go out and you're observing that, you say, okay, we're getting a couple of layers per year here. You extrapolate that evidence. You look at this, you say, okay, well, it must have been 1 or 2. You think, wow, it must have taken hundreds of thousands of years to lay down.
That's very reasonable.
Right.
That's eminently reasonable.
Sure.
Nothing wrong with that.
Yep.
But it's wrong. Those layers in that photograph were not laid down over any length of time.
And
it was very, very fast.
Just so, when I have a skeptic, and they say, well, it's unreasonable to consider that Noah's flood could have caused all these layers. It's like, well, wait a sec. These layers were laid down very quickly. Why is it unreasonable to think that the other layers were laid down? It's not unreasonable. Right. We don't have unreasonable arguments, is my point as creationists.
And Mount St. Helens did some pretty cool things. I mean, here's a picture of Grand Canyon. Mount St. Helens was only a few mud flows on the top of a mountain. What would a global flood do?
Right.
Now, you look at the things on a relatively small scale, still a pretty interesting scale at Mount St. Helens, and ramp everything up to the massive catastrophe of Noah's flood and the breakup of the continents, all kinds of things like that. Is that a better explanation for Grand Canyon? You know what? We've been to Grand Canyon many times and looked at that, and a flood is a great explanation for some of these things that we see here.